Good afternoon, Synod. We come now to item 11. You will need GS 2238. This is a presentation on the vision and strategy program of work to provide us with an update on this program. The Archbishop of York will be making the presentation, and following the presentation, there will be opportunity for questions. And may I remind folks from the outset, please do not write long speeches. We're only taking questions at that point. So I call upon the Archbishop of York now to make his presentation.
Thank you, Rose. Stephen Cottrell, Archbishop of York, 002. I'd like to begin this presentation with a short film which shows us what mixed ecology has been a misunderstood phrase, I think, for some of us, but I hope will begin to show what this means primarily in the life of one diocese. Hopefully the technology this afternoon will work.
The gospel is good news for all people, and the church is God's great idea for all nations. In this video, you will see a snapshot of the inspiring ways the church in Suffolk will creatively connect with the communities with the good news of Jesus. Mixed ecology will look different in every place. What we see in Suffolk is happening in Rochester, where I am leaving, and in Leicester, to where I am going, and all over the country in different ways, reflecting the diversity of the contexts.
Hello, my name's Mike Harrison. I'm the suffragan bishop in the Diocese of St Edmundsbury and Ipswich, covering the beautiful county of Suffolk. We have coastal areas, deeply rural areas, small market towns, and larger urban areas. Here the churches are seeking to reach out, connect, and serve their local communities. Here are some examples for you of the mixed ecology that is happening in this diocese.
So Lightwave is about reaching people that are on the edge of church or not going to church. So our aim was really to bring the church back into the center of communities, and we do this through our themed cafes. So we have a toddler cafe, a youth cafe, seasons cafe, and a sports cafe. Well, we have seen huge impact on people's lives. People coming in that have been destitute, lonely, don't know anybody. And this has just been that safe space for them to come in. And people have come to know Jesus.
It's reached every area of my life, my relationships with my family, with my friends, my lifestyle has changed. I'm more fulfilled. I feel like I'm more joyous and just in love with the world, really, and people. It's just great. It's great.
The church can be the centre of community again. And it's not about just sort of saying, come to church. It's about saying, let's be church together.
We started to connect because we've had lots of contact with families through baptism, through weddings. So out of that developed a vision to connect with the wider community for people of all ages.
New families that have come to the village and for the school, I always suggest to come to Connect because it's a way of meeting people outside of a formal setting. And I think what it's done is it's brought the children and me and my husband together in the church. So we come on a Sunday and we all enjoy the church together.
So for me, the most exciting thing is new people coming in, but being supported by our existing congregations. It's beginning to change people's lives. They're becoming more confident about speaking about their faith.
Limburg Road Community Church, we've met an amazing variety of people. We've got people who've come as refugees, people as asylum seekers, people who've lived here for years and years and years with their families. The range of people we're getting to know is just huge.
The youth work has looked like a number of things. We've been out meeting young people on the street. We started something called Games on the Green, and we've been involved with a library project locally, working with young people to make media for digital platforms.
Our big blue gazebo goes up on the drive and people go, it's church. So I think people are seeing church not just as people going into a building, they're seeing church as the people and the people serving their community.
If we had to pull any verse out of the Bible, any story out of the Bible, it's the Samaritan woman at the well. It's exactly what drives us, what gives us inspiration for what we're doing. It's the story of Jesus going to the ordinary place where the ordinary people were and sitting there and meeting needs. And that is exactly what we do.
When we first started chaplaincy, it was all about supporting students and staff and also exploring those big questions about faith and life through assemblies and clubs, and also building community, linking with local churches and communities too.
I think the impact that Josh has had is that actually our children can connect with something that is spiritual in nature, that there's a wider purpose, that we're here for a reason.
When I'm feeling down, he would cheer me up. He helps with clubs sometimes, so like theology club and gardening club. Just nice to know there's someone there to have my back.
We've been able to pioneer something through having a chaplain here full-time to provide pastoral support, but also offering a whole range of different clubs and activities and amazing spaces like this reflection room. My hope for the future is that more schools and churches might be able to work together to create something like this. It will look different in every context, but wouldn't it be amazing if every school could have a chaplain? Wouldn't it be amazing if every school had a space like this for contemplation, prayer and reflection? That's my hope for the future.
I hope you enjoyed seeing this snapshot of the mixed ecology approach in Suffolk. I'd really encourage you to take this forward and consider ways in which imaginatively and creatively you can provide ways into the gospel for that large proportion of our population that as of yet haven't engaged with Christianity.
So, dear friends, as you know, the vision for the Church of England in the 2020s is to become a Christ-centred and a Jesus Christ-shaped church, which means primarily a spiritual and a theological renewal, deepening our prayer, delighting in worship. And I was so grateful for our chaplain's homily this morning on the beauty of holiness, but also to be so challenged by our life in Christ that it overflows in loving service to the world, creating more spaces where more people can encounter Christ, as we saw in the mighty diocese of St Edmundsbury and Ipswich. And I know we could have gone to any diocese in the Church of England and found similar things. Hence also the importance of putting the 5 marks of mission at the heart of what it means to live what the Anglican Communion calls a Jesus-shaped life. As you know, 3 strategic priorities have emerged: to be a church of missionary disciples, to be a younger and more diverse church, and to be a church where mixed ecology is the norm in the ways we've just seen demonstrated, but which of course will look different in different contexts, geographies, demographies, and according to different needs. Starting today with mixed ecology, over the next few synods, we're going to dig into these ideas to learn from each other and see how they can help us move the Church of England into deeper and more sustained growth. I'm sorry if some of this has not always been presented as clearly as it should and has caused, for some people, some nervousness. But this afternoon, let me try to be very clear. When we speak about mixed ecology, we are speaking about the whole ecosystem of the church, not one way of being church replacing another. The historic vocation of the Church of England is to be the church for everyone, everywhere. We are the national church. We want every person we serve to have an opportunity to encounter the transformation that a life centered on Jesus Christ can bring. We therefore need to find ways of reaching and serving people in the very diverse circumstances and contexts of our national life today, in places of leisure, work, education, as well as the local neighbourhood, online as well as in person. And actually, we're getting quite good at that. I understand this to be the revitalisation of parish, not its demise. And I note with joy the fact that it is already happening in many places. This is why in the paper our 6 bold outcomes seek a parish system revitalised for mission through a mixed ecology church, creating new Christian communities across those 4 areas of home, work and education, social and digital, where we live our lives. And therefore, we are not, absolutely not, firing the starting gun on something new. Much of this, as we've seen, is already happening in parishes of all traditions. Rather, what we're doing is we're catching up with the work of the Holy Spirit, who has already danced ahead of us and is blessing Messy Church, school chaplaincy, and all sorts of other online gatherings for prayer and discipleship. There is also a theological and a missiological imperative. We have been charged to make disciples of all nations and therefore all peoples and all cultures. Therefore, one size won't fit all. It takes the whole world to know Christ. I said this to some of the young people on Monday. If I'd have been in charge, if you forgive such a thought, if I'd have been in charge at Pentecost, I would have done it differently. If I'd have been in charge at Pentecost, what I would have done is I would have got, much more sensible, I would have got the whole world to speak one language. That would be a much better way of communicating the message. Much more efficient. But that, of course, is precisely what the Holy Spirit doesn't do. Not the whole world speaking one language, but the church speaking every language. Because place and context really, really matter. So from that point onwards, from Pentecost onwards, the story of Christian mission has been the story of cultural adaptability as the unchanging message of what God has done in Jesus Christ through his death and resurrection is translated into the constantly changing languages and cultures of human experience. If you want a book to read about this, by the way, I can recommend one. It's called The New Testament. This work, the work of the Holy Spirit to bring Christ to every person and every place, doesn't stop. And we are, as I said yesterday, always moving into the uncharted territory of new cultures and new contexts. Therefore, we want to see the ecosystem of the church expressed in these ways. First, a viable, sustainable presence in every neighbourhood, i.e. the parish church, and with a particular care for our poorest communities. Usually growing from that, new communities of faith, new expressions of Christian community, both online but also in person. Mission initiatives, large and small, like Messy Church or after-school clubs or workplace chaplaincies. Hey, Synod, maybe even 10,000 of them. 3, we want to develop chaplaincy. not just in schools, universities, prisons, hospitals, but sports and workplace chaplaincy, even shopping centres. This is an area of growth and opportunity. And fourthly, we long to see a renewal of the religious life. Most movements of renewal in the church have begun with a new experience of God, a new delight in prayer and worship and the sacramental life. And there are signs of this happening in small and unexpected ways, and we must nurture them. Our work as Synod is to understand and see what God is doing through this. Make sure that we don't get left behind and align our resources centrally and our training for the next generation of clergy and lay ministers to this rediscovery of what it truly means to be the church with a mission for everyone, a mixed ecology. Pope Francis has put it this way: the church is a people with many faces and expresses its truth in countless different ways according to each culture. He goes on, that is why I like to think that evangelization must always be in the dialect of each place, with the same words and sounds that a grandmother uses to sing lullabies to her grandchildren. And what a beautiful way of thinking about evangelism. Singing the song of the gospel in the language of the people we serve, all of them, everywhere, especially those who are excluded. Yesterday we looked at the beginning of John 21. Let me finish at the end of that chapter, therefore at the end of John's gospel itself. John says that if everything that Jesus did was written down, then the world itself couldn't contain all the books that would be written. Now, I don't think John just means writing down all the things that Jesus said and did in his ministry which didn't make it into the Gospels. I think he means all the things that Jesus continues to do, continues to say in the power of the Spirit through his church. Through his church, which is us, the responsibilities we carry. We are the ones who are called to live and tell Christ's story, recognizing that in order to reach everyone everywhere, we need to become, as we've always been, a mixed ecology church. This, of course, is still a church under the oversight of bishops and synods, with parish clergy having the cure of souls. None of this changes. But the whole point of the cure of souls is it refers to everyone in the parish, not just a gathered congregation. Synod. It is for the re-expression and revitalization of this vision that I invite us to consider how we can align our resources to enable the church to flourish in many different ways and for Jesus to be made known. And I now look forward to your questions.
We come now to the questions. I shall be taking them in batches of 3. Thomas Civil, and then I would like to call the lady with the orange scarf, followed by, is Paul Bradbury standing? Yes? Followed by Paul. Thank you.
Thomas Seville, 447, Religious Communities. Archbishop, in the light of your comments yesterday, and which you have echoed today, about the emphasis which is also being put on a mission in parishes, may I ask what measures are in place and being considered for the amendment of the criterion, which I think is given in for SDF funding, of funding needing to be directed to population centres of, I think it's 100,000. In other words, can some of this money be released more liberally for small-scale parish-based projects?
Catherine Butcher, Chichester 286. I welcome the Archbishop of York's emphasis on us speaking everyday language and using local dialects. I trained as a journalist so I could learn to share my faith in everyday language, but in preparing to lead church services, I'm required to use authorised liturgical language. How will we make it possible for every person to access an expression of church in ways that make sense to them, when we often use words that don't make sense and sound like gobbledygook? When we often use written resources with inaccessible graduate-level language that doesn't make sense to the majority of people in our parishes. In pursuing this ambitious vision,
Can we have your question, please?
Will we be authorised to speak in more normal language where appropriate? Thank you.
Paul Bradbury, Salisbury 211. Thank you, Archbishop, for the vision of emerging church and this aspiration of a mixed ecology of church. The role of pioneers, lay and ordained, with a particular gift and calling for the cross-cultural, contextual mission and church planting, will be crucial for the development of a mixed ecology of church. I'm involved in the training of lay pioneers through the CMS certificate and the offer of a national programme of training for pioneer curates. And at present, there are two particular concerns regarding the training and deployment of pioneers. Firstly, lay pioneers must fund all their own training. And secondly, there is a significant concern amongst ordained pioneers about how they can continue in their vocation and ministry beyond curacy. Could the Archbishop say what plans are being considered, firstly, for the support of training of lay pioneers, and secondly, for a strategic look at the way in which ordained stipendiary ministry might be deployed to achieve this ambition of a mixed ecology of church?
Thank you. Archbishop?
Thank you so much for those questions. Father Thomas, first of all, it has been agreed in principle, a lot of detail to be worked out, that obviously finance must follow vision. So now that we have some strategic priorities that still need lots of work on it, it follows that the funding that is available needs to be aligned to the vision. Work on that has begun, and nothing is off the table. And I'm sure you will continue to hold us to friendly account on that. But I think what we heard from John Spence this morning is another indicator that we are looking again at those things in the light of this vision and strategy. Catherine, thank you very much for your question. I often think that common worship actually gives us much greater leeway than we sometimes realise. So I entirely recognise what you're saying, and I think the Liturgical Commission will continue to do work of offering simpler liturgies that we do need in some contexts, but there's a lot that we can do. But basically, I agree with you, with the one caveat that just as with the nurture of our children, so with the nurture of new disciples, part of that nurturing is to be nurtured into the fullness of the Christian faith. And at some point, therefore, we need to encounter the beautiful, rich, conceptual ideas at the heart of our faith, which I don't think we want to argue away. So before long, we do need to talk about the Trinity. We do need to talk about the sacraments. We do need to talk about reconciliation. You know, these can be. We need to talk about sin and forgiveness. These are not concepts that are widely known in the world, So it's about being alongside people, developing good relationships, and then in that, finding the right language. But missiologically, what you raise is massively important. Paul, thank you for your question. This is something we are continuing, by we, I mean the church, ministry division and others are looking at, and I'm very aware of the challenges around curacies for ordained pioneer ministers. We probably need to develop different models, and I think that is being looked at.
Thank you. Peter Adams, David Kemp, and is that Miranda? Thank you.
Peter Adams, 392 St Albans. Thank you so much, Archbishop Stephen. Could you tell us how has the Vision and Strategy Group specifically reviewed and learned from the lessons from the many projects funded by the SDF, Strategic Development Funding? Many of these projects have explored new forms of church at scale in a way that can be evaluated, and indeed the governance of them has required substantial monitoring. Secondly, what thought has been given to the use of the place of the deanery as a missional entity? Many deaneries, both in cities and in rural areas, offer opportunities for work that small parishes are unable to sustain. Thank you.
David Kemp, Canterbury 263. I speak from the experience of the team ministry of 5 churches of Whitstable on the North Kent coast. The future aspiration is simpler, humbler, bolder. The present reality is smaller, congregations down by 30 to 40%, poorer, income down by 10 to 20%, less confidence and energy. We can't even fill the Sunday morning coffee rota. Archbishop, are you able and willing to be patient with the churches and parishes who have been through the car crash of COVID?
Miranda Threlfall-Holmes, Liverpool 156. Thank you very much for that presentation. I was on the working group for mixed ecology and really enjoyed and was delighted to see the change in the language from mixed economy to mixed ecology, which I think is incredibly rich. I was a bit disappointed with the film, which seemed to just be about doing mixed stuff, rather than using that richness of the vision of ecology and the idea of the cycling of nutrients. And my question is, we as the Church of England, it doesn't seem to me, are the ecology. We are part of an ecology of the church. So how much is or can this vision be ecumenical?
Again, thank you so much. First of all, Peter, there isn't a vision and strategy group, and there kind of never has been. There's been lots and lots of different groups of people meeting and talking. There has never been a group. In fact, I would like to think the General Synod of the Church of England is now the Vision and Strategy Group, who will be overseeing this and sharing wisdom and working together. There is an independent review happening, ongoing, into the use of SDF. David Kemp, thank you so much for your question and your honesty. I am very, very aware that many parishes, what it feels like is to be smaller, poorer, and feeling timid and frightened of the future. I'm very, very aware of that. And the vision and strategy is a vision and strategy for the 2020s. It's something that we see unfolding over the medium term of the next 10 years. So I hope there's lots and lots of room for patience. And I think I'd also say it's because we know how tough it is in so many places that we want to bring some fresh vision, some fresh energy, where we can, fresh resources into enabling the church to flourish. But I do not underestimate how tough it is in many, many places. Finally, Miranda, as ever, Miranda was, as she said, part of the group that was looking into this about a year ago to help shape the thinking on mixed ecology. And yes, this vision must be bigger than the Church of England. There's a lot more I could say, but now is not the time. But thank you for reminding us, particularly of the ecumenical dimension. There are others as well.
Thank you. Can I call the lady in the pink sweater? May I call you as well? Thank you. And gentleman there. Yes.
Rachel Mann, Manchester 171. As ever, Archbishop Stephen, an exciting presentation which speaks to my soul. But I wonder if you could say a little more about the theological work that's been done into the understanding of ecology that underpins this, and how this relates to a Church of England ecclesiology, which is so parish-centred.
Thank you. Paul Ayres, Leeds 131. There was quite a lot in the film about meeting needs, which is language that we do use quite a lot. I was taken aback by a clergy colleague last week who said to me, no, we don't have the resources to meet needs, and it's cruel to pretend that we do. Jesus told the apostles to go and find persons of peace, which meant people that will take you in and serve you. And he said our job is not to invite people to be served, but to serve. Jesus didn't meet the needs of the woman at the well, as was said in the film. She met his. And we're not Lady Bountiful going around handing out largesse to our dependents. I wonder whether you think we should be changing our language on this and being, maybe that's part of being humbler.
Amato Christian Iwago, London 159. Archbishop, thank you very much for the mixed ecology model, which we are now using to describe the mission and ministry and vision of our church. Paul visited Athens, and when he got there, he found an inscription that says, "Unknown God." And I think I'm here to remind you that in this mixed ecology, seems to me that there is emphasis on parishes, chaplains, LLMs, and I recognize that we are moving in an uncharted territory, as you quoted, and therefore we must cast our nets, as we are reminded yesterday by the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Question.
Not just in one place.
Can we have the question?
My question is, where is the role of SSMs in this model of mixed ecology?
Thank you, Rachel. As ever, thank you so much for your question. And I say with a smile, I feel I've moved on a bit. That I'm not being accused of the Nestorian heresy in the theological interrogation of this. And of course, there isn't time here to say much more, except that there is a group which Synod will hear from in due course over these sessions, looking into the theological underpinning of this. They have completed the first stage of their work. The second stage, Isabel Hamley has now picked up the baton from David Ford, and Isabel is going to be with others producing both resources for us to receive, but also actually things for us to enter into creatively to talk through this, because there is some unanswered theological questions. I think they're exciting ones, which for me are about, the rediscovery of what does it mean to be the church for everyone. To use a simple, bearing in mind earlier things, the simplest language I can. What does it mean in a smorgasbord of cultures like ours, where people live their lives in such radically different ways? What does it mean to be the church for everyone, which I think has been our vocation? and hence we've used language like the revitalisation of parish. We don't want to set one way of being church in stone. Hans Küng, the great Swiss theologian, said, to do the same thing when everything else around you changes is not to do the same thing. Or to put it another way, in order to stay the same, we're going to have to change. Or we're going to walk forwards, backwards. It's those paradoxical ideas which really do need some digging into. I hope we might even do that at Synod at some point and make a nice change from some of the other things we talk about. But I'm hugely grateful for the question. This is about a theological renewal as well as a missiological and spiritual renewal. The question about meeting needs, to an extent I entirely agree with you, though I thought the example of chaplaincy wasn't like that. And as I said, those of you who were at the worship this morning, I thought the homily this morning was really superb, giving us a window into a very different approach to ministry, which is much more typified by those of us in chaplaincy ministry than those of us in parochial ministry. So we need to let these models flourish alongside each other and in communion with each other. And Amatu, I could say a lot, but I mean, I take it as read, but perhaps I should have said that let me put it this way. Ministry belongs to the whole people of God. That's our starting point. It's about our baptism. And we all therefore have a share in God's ministry and mission of love to the world and play our different part. Some of us are called to be ordained, and within that ordained ministry there's many different ways of expressing it, and we need more of everything, is the way I would put it. And certainly there's a huge place for self-supporting ministry, and for self-supporting ministry often to take greater positions of leadership and oversight in the church.
Thank you. Can I have the lady at the back, please? And is Mike Tufnell? Yes, I thought that was you. Next, followed by the lady here. Thank you.
Ros Clark, Lichfield 336. I'm very glad to hear the Archbishop confirm that the goal of this vision and strategy is church growth. I wonder what research has been done or has been planned to analyse whether the kinds of projects mentioned, especially those that are not primarily located in the parish, do in fact lead to church growth, and whether those projects are more or less effective than stipendiary parish ministry. Are there plans for pilot schemes to test the mixed ecology church?
Mike Tufnell, Salisbury 214. I hope the chair will give me grace to briefly ground my question, which is about the resourcing of youth chaplaincy as part of a mixed ecology approach, in a story from my local context. At the end of last year, a 16-year-old young woman from a troubled background was excluded from our local upper school and thrown out of home at the same time. Since then, our youth pastor, part of that school's chaplaincy team, helped connect the young lady with a newly formed community pastoral team given oversight by our curate. That pastoral team in turn provided her with a mentor, helping her to support her continued education elsewhere. She's now apprenticing in a community cafe kitchen and recently prepared a delicious lunch for me. Finally, coming to my question. A missional community in our deanery currently meets in that same cafe space, and through their meeting in that local space, understandably perceived as less intimidating, that young lady has now been given an accessible discipleship pathway to exploring faith in Jesus Christ. My question, is this the kind of mixed ecology approach envisioned by this vision and strategy? And will extra central funding and strategic training come soon to help the excellent work of local youth pastors who provide crucial support through school chaplaincy? As we saw in the excellent video earlier, in a time where the mental well-being of young people is in crisis, and yet the opportunity for the gospel is great.
I think you've asked the question. Thank you. Did we answer one more?
Owen Folks, Chichester, number 95. The vision is exciting. It's creative and bold, and I can see parishes, many of my colleagues, wanting to engage with this. But my question is, when you receive applications to cover the costs of administration and building maintenance and all the ordinary things that would liberate parish clergy, church wardens and officers of the ordinary parishes of the Church of England, will they be dismissed for not being shiny enough?
Because I think I can deal with them relatively briefly, though they're really important questions. The answer to the last question is no. You know, of course, we will look at everything that's put forward, and no, there isn't a sort of criteria in the ways that you suggest. Though I realise it may well feel like that sometimes. To Mike, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. To the things you raise and the vital importance of resourcing ministry with young people. One of our objectives is to be a younger church, and our financial resources that we have must be aligned to, and will be aligned to that. I want to spend a bit more, if I may, on Rosalind's important question, because perhaps I haven't made myself as clear as I should have done. I'm trying to. As I see it, the mixed ecology is the parish. It's not there's something else called mixed ecology. The mixed ecology is the way in which we fulfill our vocation, and almost all the examples you will find of these new initiatives come through parish ministry. It started because a parish church and a vicar and a PCC actually saw a missional need and started something new to meet it. So I don't see these things as two separate things. And if some people do have real principled theological difficulties about this concept, then I will have a discussion with you, but only if you cancel your 8 o'clock. Because you know, it's important to recognise that. Most parishes have 2 services on a Sunday, an 8 o'clock and let's say call it a 10 o'clock. And I don't think you say to the people at the end of the 8 o'clock, you must come back at 10 o'clock, because we don't run a mixed ecology church here. We are just the one church. Now, we recognised centuries ago that actually different services meet the different needs of different groups of people. And that's the system we've been running for a long while. And then we used to have evensong as well. And then we'd have a youth group. And then biggest growth area when I was a parish priest was the Wednesday morning mass. And I have to say, I did spend a long time persuading people who came to the Wednesday morning mass that they ought to come on Sunday because Sunday was proper church. But I discovered that they couldn't come on Sunday because for some of them it was a bone of contention within their family about what happened on Sundays. Some of them were visiting family a long way away on Sundays. It took me a couple of years for the penny to drop and say, I'm fighting a rearguard action to keep Sunday special. The Holy Spirit is blessing Wednesday. Wake up, you know. Wake up, smell the incense. And I put resources into Wednesday. We'd have coffee after the service on Wednesday. We started singing hymns on Wednesday. I worked a bit harder on the homily on Wednesday. We had discussion groups on Wednesdays. When I left that parish, it wasn't unusual to have between 40 and 50 people on a Wednesday. I was a bog-standard traditional Anglo-Catholic priest. Am I trained at St. Stephen's House, for goodness sake? You know, we never talked about mixed ecology, I can assure you. I discovered later that I was running a fresh expression. So, you know, let's get real. This is happening through parishes. I don't suppose there's a parish represented here which isn't doing something like that. All we're saying is we want to do more of it. That's all we're saying. And I believe we can do it. But we need to do it together and we need to resource it.
Thank you, Archbishop.
And there's lots of evidence to support this as well.
I think we might just be able to... I think we might just be able to squeeze in the last batch. The gentleman standing here with the red folder, I think you are Bishop Rick, but I can't see you very well with your thank you. And this gentleman here with the, yes, the one who just turned around. Thank you.
I think that was me, Adrian Greenwood, Southwark 415. Thanks so much, Bishop Stephen, and particularly the stuff about language. I'll remind you all that in 1985, Faith in the City said, let's have some ministers drawn from indigenous communities and trained in the language of their communities. I'm a great supporter of mixed ecology. I just got two cautions. One is...
Can it be a question, please?
Yes.
Because we're running out of time.
Do you agree with me, Bishop Stephen, that one of the dangers in talking about mixed ecology church is that we just forget that, or we just concentrate on the 2 hours, and that mixed ecology church is about the whole of life. And my second point is that there's a bit of consumerism in some of the language, particularly paragraph 12, I think it is, about people being able to pick where they go. We need to remember that part of church is that we are a learning community, and what we need to learn is the essential truths of the faith of Jesus Christ as we have received them through the creeds, etc., etc. So let's play down on continuum.
Rick Thorpe, London 49. Thank you, Archbishop, for sharing this part of the vision and strategy with us. I'm really excited about it because the main focus of my work is to plant new congregations and encourage that throughout the Church of England. So it is already happening, and it is happening under our noses and has been for many, many years. And there's a growing movement of particularly lay-led congregations and new worshipping communities overseen by priests. This is happening. Has been for many, many years already. So this ambition of 10,000 associates with 12,500 parishes. That means we can all be involved.
Can we have your question,
yes,
Bishop?
So, the question is, how can we encourage, in the light of that number, every parish to be involved, from every tradition, in every place, so that we can join in with this movement of God?
Christian Silverhampton, York 243. Is the Archbishop aware of research on church health and church growth that observes that one characteristic of healthy churches that continue to grow is a significant act of giving away in mission every 5 years or so? It seems the act of sending people and resources to new mission projects is an investment that every church can make in sustaining its continued missional growth. Archbishop, how might we encourage this sort of spirit of generous mission and quite ready or feel a bit too small, but who might nevertheless benefit from an act of sending in mission that benefits both those they send to and themselves as well?
Thank you. I invite the Archbishop up for the last time for a brief response.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Sorry. Christian, yes, I am aware of some of that research, and along with Adrian Greenwood's question, I want to make the connection between our desire to find ways of being church for more people in more places and our desire for us to be a church of missionary disciples. Therefore, this seems to me, both these questions seem to be about the life of discipleship. I keep on quoting the opening sentences of the Rule of St. Benedict, who says, I am setting up a school in the Lord's service. That's my vision for our life together in our communities, where we can, this is the place where we learn what it means to follow Jesus. And the more that happens, the more we will learn these things. And yes, many of these things will be lay-led. And this General Synod passed a motion 3 years ago inviting every parish to think about starting something like this. Let's not forget our own history and the decisions we've already made. And as I didn't get a chance to say last time, this isn't something new that we're trying that we'll research later. We will research it. It is firmly rooted in large bodies, this is to Rosalind, large bodies of research, particularly the really important research anecdote to evidence, but also the research that's done by the Church Army, which I have the privilege to chair, particularly the Church Army research is really helpful and challenging on how many of these new initiatives are, through parishes, lay-led and bearing much fruit. Thank you, Synod, so much, because I think that's it from me, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Synod. This completes item 2238, and we will now move to the next item of business. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Synod. We move to item 12, which is the report by the Governance Review Group. This is a presentation. Oh dear. Be careful. Where was I? You'll need GS 2239 for this item. And it's a presentation as in the last item, so there'll be the opportunity to ask questions. Following the Bishop of Leeds presentation, I now invite the Bishop of Leeds to make it.
Nick Baines, Leeds 22. You might be wondering why we're having a presentation rather than a debate. Well, a new synod, I think, brings enough challenges, particularly for 60% new members, to get to grips with how things work, and we decided it's best to bring a presentation. Let's have questions, get to the bottom of something that is really quite complicated, such as governance, and then in just a few weeks' time, in the new year, we'll have an opportunity then to debate it, but by then we'll have been able to drill down into some of the questions that are around. We've discovered in this work that it isn't actually patently obvious to everyone how the polity of the Church of England works. So I hope that when we get to questions, you'll feel able to ask questions, not worrying about, will I sound ignorant, will it expose my ignorance? I can assure you that even when we've spoken to quite experienced groups, ignorance emerges very fruitfully. So the purpose of what we're doing is to enable us to carry on what actually is an iterative process. What we're presenting is a report, it's not a decision, it's not a conclusion, and things will develop, and the comments and questions that emerge today will be taken on board as we go forward before the next debate at Synod. I hope that you will recognise the limitations of this report and what it is, as well as what it is not. Now, the group was set up by the Archbishops and the House of Bishops to examine the Church's national governance structures and, if appropriate, to offer proposals for reform. We started our work in August 2020. We concluded at the end of July 2021. Now, it originally emerged from concerns exposed by an earlier review of a Church Buildings Council report, and it's important to note that the governance review predated both the pandemic and the initiation of what became the emerging church work streams, which bring together vision and strategy, transforming effectiveness, and the COVID recovery work. It now forms part of that wider work in order to align with the Church's need to reshape for the future by bringing greater transparency, accountability, simplicity, and accessibility and coherence to its governance structures. Now, I need to stress at the outset that the point of the review is to find practical ways in which refocusing the national structures and processes can relieve burdens on the diocesan and the parochial in order to enable local parishes and churches to flourish. I'm joined today by two members of the GRG who are also members of the General Synod who are up here with me, Bishop Helen Ann Hartley, the Bishop of Ripon, and Joseph Dewaka, theologian and member of the Archbishop's Council, and they'll be feeding me the answers to your very profound questions. So what's the problem? It's clear that the closer you get to the national centre of church governance and administration, the more aware you become of some of the challenges to effectiveness. This isn't because people are obtuse, but because this is what happens when governance structures grow and develop over time without regular and frequent review or reform. As the world around us changes, so must the framework in which we operate also adapt. Charity law does not stand still for 25 years, which is when the Church last looked hard at its own governance. Now, I'm not going to waste Synod's time by repeating what I will take as read from the report itself, but let me summarise and contextualise the challenge, noting that in all the consultations we conducted, we found not a single voice telling us that reform is neither needed nor urgent. Indeed, we constantly and consistently heard that the Church's current national governance arrangements do not serve it well. The complex structure of boards, commissions, and committees with ill-defined and sometimes overlapping responsibilities results in a lack of clarity in decision-making, in poor engagement in consensus building, ineffective policy implementation, and weak accountability to the wider Church. Apart from that, it's brilliant. We give some specific examples in our report. The case for change was already compelling, but the post-pandemic challenges have added weight to the need for reform. Indeed, the Synod itself is unique and uniquely privileged. The General Synod is the second legislative body of England next to the Houses of Commons and the Lords. We have that privilege by virtue of being the established Church of England. During your time on Synod, you will be passing national law, not just church law, national law, which will be subject to royal assent. Now, being established by law gives us enormous privileges. For example, a national profile, a presence in every community, seats for bishops in the House of Lords, an opportunity to represent every faith organisation at national level. Now, over the years, and indeed the centuries, the Church of England's governing structures, which are both part of the state and also separate from the state, have grown up and developed at different paces and in different ways in order to adapt to an evolving political, social, and national environment. The General Synod, this may surprise you, is not a governing body. It's a legislative body, a parliament, like the Houses of Commons and Lords. The convocations in which the clergy sit today as proctors in convocation, have their origins in the Anglo-Saxon parliaments of clergy in pre-conquest times. Some of you may remember that. Over the centuries, the convocations have met to rule England in the medieval period, to enact the legislation involved in the Reformation, and to discuss matters of church and state in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The House of Laity in General Synod has its origins in the 19th century and became first a House of Laymen, and during the 20th century, a House of Laywomen as well. And the bishops, I think we've always been there. Any institution, and particularly a church which has grown up over several centuries, will have a complicated and highly fragmented set of governance structures. Now, many of these are good and they will work well, like the traditional parish in many contexts. But tweaking elements over time inevitably increases complexity and opacity unless reviewed radically. At national level, the Church of England has 7 governance bodies, 7, currently collectively known as the National Church Institutions. And after a year chairing the Governance Review Group, I can name every one of them. The Archbishop's Council, the Church Commissioners, the Church of England Pensions Board, the offices of the Archbishops of Lambeth and Lambeth and Bishopthorpe, the Church of England Central Services, which oversees some of the national operations such as finance, IT, legal, HR. The National Society, which oversees church, schools and education matters in England and Wales. 7, maybe to you sounds manageable. However, a recent rough count of all the committees and boards which are serviced by the staff team at Church House London revealed 122 bodies. For a church which seeks, for the sake of the kingdom of God, to be simpler, humbler, and bolder, 7 governing bodies and 122 subcommittees probably wasn't what Jesus had in mind when he commissioned Peter to the task of feeding and growing a church. Over the years, we have seen how this fragmented, many-faced, top-heavy national structure doesn't always serve the church well. To be blunt, if the structure and polity is too hard for a member of today's synod to recount and explain to a member of our congregations, then something needs to be done. I well remember the last report which looked at the church's national governance structures in the mid-1990s. The Turnbull report recommended the creation of a single national council and wanted to focus the activities of the church commissioners on asset management only, moving all other functions into the national council. This didn't happen in practice, mainly because the various vested interests defended their territories against the Turnbull proposals. The national governance arrangements we have now remain fragmented and unclear because we didn't grasp that nettle at the time. I think, and I know I would say this, that the Governance Review Group recommendations are more nuanced and in tune with the practical needs of the church than the Turnbull ones of the late last century. We recognised that not all church governance can be put into a single organisation. This was because some of the bodies come under separate jurisdiction: the Pensions Board, the National Society, the Independent Safeguarding Board, which we've just set up, or because of the rationale for ring-fencing the management of the historic assets. In the course of our work, the GRG examined a range of instances where the church's fragmented national governance structures had failed. These included failures to implement work on church buildings mandated by General Synod, miscommunications between different governance bodies on ministry planning, and perhaps most devastatingly, a failure over decades by the church's governance bodies to grip safeguarding and to protect the most vulnerable in our churches and communities. The reality is that when the church nationally faces a difficult or challenging issue or decision, it can all too easily fall between the gaps in our national governance bodies. The challenge addressed by Turnbull has not gone away. A vision for a more integrated and coherent national church structure remains to be implemented. Had we done this sooner, I venture to suggest that some of our church's failings might have been avoided or at the very least mitigated. So let me summarize briefly recommendations in the report. Firstly, and most importantly, we recommend the reduction in the number of governing bodies in the church at national level by merging most of the national functions of the Church of England into a single national body, provisionally named Church of England National Services, unless someone can give us a better name. And don't focus on the name. It's what it has to do that we have to work on first. This would be a charitable body established under charity law with a board of trustees comprising a diverse and appropriately skilled and experienced group of clergy and lay people. Now, we've made this suggestion because we wanted to enable the governance of the national church to have a more unified vision and strategy. Yes, important words that we've just been looking at. We felt that this vision would be best delivered by a more unified governance structure. We have suggested that legislation should be introduced to ensure what you might call a bonfire of the committees, a reduction of the large number of boards and committees which exist at national level, costing money and time and energy. We've recommended that the national services should be served by the minimum number of subcommittees necessary, each with clear terms of reference and reporting lines into the main board. Secondly, we looked hard at the roles that bishops should play in our national governance structures. Bishops are the historic leaders of the Church of England, playing a central role in our ecclesiology as pastors, teachers, evangelists, and leaders. And this is why we thought that the role of the College of Bishops in the national life of the church should be enhanced. All bishops could potentially be involved in the national church, not just those of us who are members of the House of Bishops of the General Synod. Having said that, it's not practical for the College of Bishops to form a separate governance body at, I think, 113 members. There are just too many. And we wanted the SENS to have a mixture of laity, clergy, and bishops, as well as having the right professional skill sets that are needed on a modern board. So we suggested the creation of an elected board of bishops, which could be the interlocutor between the bishops and the SENS, and could also liaise with the other governance bodies. We had questions remaining about exactly how involved bishops should become in detailed technical projects and initiatives at national level. Bishops are called primarily to be pastors and spiritual leaders. They have a vital role in mission and pastoral life within their dioceses and in the vision, strategy, and policy of the Church of England. How far bishops should be drawn into the detail of the day-to-day running of the national church is less clear. We have suggested that there should be a review of the role of lead bishop, and if it is to continue, a role description should be developed which gives a much clearer definition of the expected contribution and demands of the role. If I can just interject there, there's a difference between leading and chairing. Thirdly, there were some areas where the GRG recommended that independent governance arrangements should continue. After considerable debate, we concluded strongly that the management of the church's historic assets should remain independent. The Pensions Board, the National Society, and the new Independent Safeguarding Board have to remain independent, since they have separate arrangements for their governance and oversight, which would be difficult to unravel at this point. That is not to say that future developments won't revisit these decisions. For example, National Society also comprises Wales, so we can't just unilaterally fiddle with it. But if the National Society were to come back and say we really think we ought to be part of this new body, then that will be the time to respond. So I come to two of the recommendations in the report, which I think, having followed social media, will be of particular interest to the General Synod. First of these is the suggestion of a nominations committee. The current makeup of our boards and committees emphasises representation over skill sets or competence, representation of constituencies, churchmanship, and other categories, often not owned up to. As we make clear, this is not in line with Charity Commission best practice under its 7 principles of good governance, which you can read in the report. That is not to say that our boards and committees do not contain many hugely gifted people. They very clearly do. But there remains a challenge in balancing representation, elected membership, and relevant skills and experience, by which we come to appointment. For example, the Synod repeatedly calls for greater diversity. Can it deliver it? Has it delivered it? Representation is very important in connecting these bodies to the rest of the church. But at the same time, when we ask such bodies to take complex and technical decisions about finance, human resources, risk, and many other things, we need to be confident that we have the best professional skills available to help them to do so. And you know this from the boards and trusts with which you are involved in other charitable or business sectors. And true diversity of membership is critical here, morally and in terms of good business sense. While it would be untrue to say that elections cannot achieve diversity or match skill sets to roles, they're not so specifically designed to do so as are well-run recruitment processes. The GRG is clear that elected membership is here to stay, but we need to make the system work harder, and we can't duck this challenge. Now, the review group would argue that the question of committee memberships also exposes a significant fault line in church culture, namely that of trust. It seems we do not trust our governance bodies, however skilled, to carry out their jobs unless we have a range of people from our various parties and positions actually in the room. Even when much of the time the decisions of our boards and committees, the decisions that they're making are ones where issues of churchmanship, tradition, and other categories do not apply. Now, secondly, I'd like to speak to the GRG's recommendation that some thinking should be done on reform of the synodical system. Then I'll come into land. The General Synod was not one of the bodies that the Governance Review Group was asked to review. It was beyond our remit. And yet it came up again and again in the focus groups we ran with a wide range of grassroots voices from the parishes, cathedrals, TEIs, and other bodies. We spoke to young people, UKME people, ordained and lay, those with significant experience of synod and the national church operations, and those without that experience. Almost without exception, what we heard was that synod was seen as being out of touch, factional, dominated by parties, and not representative of the concerns of the parish and the local church. And I recognise that we are elected by deaneries. Now, I'd like to turn this suggestion over to you as the new General Synod with a predominance of new members. What kind of General Synod do you think that the Church needs in the future? How can this Synod help shape that vision? And it would be wonderful if this Synod could start a journey of honest conversations both within itself and in the wider Church about just these kind of fundamental questions. The GRG only ever met on Zoom and was required to complete its work in 1 year. Hence, the proposals that you see in the report might not be perfect or complete, but they do, A, tackle the remit we were given, and B, take seriously the need to aim to reduce the number of governance bodies that the national church has, and to make the purpose of those that remain clearer to understand internally and externally. In other words, to make them more accountable, including, importantly, to the General Synod itself. And to cut costs. Servicing 7 governance bodies, a church parliament, and 122 committees gets expensive. And it's the parishes who ultimately pay for much of these costs via the diocese through the parish share. The GRG wanted to make proposals that enabled reductions in overheads and the best, most effective use of precious resources. And I'm grateful to the group who devoted considerable time, passion, expertise, wisdom, and argument, there was lots of that, to the work committed to us. Before we turn to questions, I just want to return to lessons from the past, notably Turnbull. More could have been achieved 25 years ago, and perhaps we might have avoided some of the problems we've experienced in recent years. Times have changed, and so has the church, and so have public expectations regarding the governance standards expected of public bodies in the 21st century. Many of the group's recommendations, if implemented, will not require legislative change. But for those that do, the General Synod has a historic role to play in considering, amending, and passing that legislation. No doubt many of our recommendations can be improved and will require further thinking and more detail. Indeed, we indicate in the report areas still to be considered or where there was not full agreement. But I urge you not to let history repeat itself. Don't let these proposals be torn apart by interest groups without thinking of the wider group of the church. You have the opportunity as a synod to support the church to build a coherent governance structure at national level. Indeed, if you don't like elements of our recommendations, then I would say don't just criticize them, but offer constructive alternatives that will better serve the mission of the church. If you don't like the answer to the question, provide a better answer. But no one's denying the question. We started this journey 25 years ago. It's for us, the new General Synod, to continue that journey and shape the governance of the church in such a way as to ensure that future generations will bless and not curse us for the decisions we make now. Thank you.
Thank you. We now invite questions. We're going to take these in batches of 3. And the Bishop of Leeds will then respond to those. There's been a few requests to actually ask questions. Is Luke Appleton standing? Luke? Mark Bennett? Mark? Father Thomas? And Father Thomas, thank you.
Hello, Luke Appleton, Exeter 309. Thank you very much, Bishop, for your presentation. My question is it possible to reform and simplify the church without an increase in centralisation? And also, if there are issues within General Synod, is there a possibility to address those issues without impacting on democratic representation? Thank you.
Mark Bennett, Oxford 184. I wanted to address questions to 2 aspects of the report. First, on accountability. If this is truly to be a review of governance rather than a review of structures, don't we need a more extensive engagement with accountability than we're given in paragraph 65 of the report? And don't we need to do that also because accountability has been a presenting issue in both ICSA and the concerns about the clergy discipline measure, and also because accountability is a potential driver of the culture change which we need and which has been promised externally as well as internally. I ask this question, I am an accountant. Second, and I hope this is taken in a friendly way because I've heard things to encourage me in this synod. We heard yesterday and earlier today in questions and presentations about many of the things that the centre can't or shouldn't do, and also about how our front line is so important. It's really good to see vision highlighted as the first bullet in paragraph 136 as a thing that we should be attending to through our central bodies. But doesn't the vision, as we also heard yesterday, belong principally on the front line? Negatively, if we have a central body...
Could you get to the question quite quickly, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Positively, could the responsibility for vision not be better stated as discerning, resourcing and enabling the vision rather than developing, communicating and executing it?
Father Thomas.
Father Thomas, Religious Communities 447. If I may express my surprise at the quality of this report, its acuity, its account of a very complicated structure, and express my surprise also at the warmth I feel towards it. It's often said that Catholic group is the group which always says no. I hope, yes, at least this one, wishes to say a warm yes. I would like the Bishop, if he would be so good, as to comment on the relation between subsidiarity and the proposed new body, which seems to be one of the issues which perhaps I see as in draft form, but in draft form as penciled in rather than in with ink.
Bishop Nick, thank you.
Thank you. The first question, Luke Appleton, about centralisation. This is not about centralisation, it's about clarification. Where you have the opacity that we have at the moment because of a plethora of bodies, it's easy to play in the gaps. And the lack of ability most people have to, it came up this morning, didn't it, in relation to the budget. Who makes the decisions? Where are they made? On what basis? By whom? What we're aiming at here, and I'm not going to say we've got everything right, is how we get clarification, because clarification leads to greater transparency, and transparency is key to accountability. So that's what we've been aiming at. The question about democratic representation, we've been careful to try to ensure that that happens, that is there. But we can't duck the question of where democratic representation doesn't necessarily give you the particular skills you need or experience on bodies governed by charity law. That's the conundrum. There may be a better answer to it, but that's the question we've got to address. And that feeds into Mark Bennett's question about accountability. I think I've just said really what I want to say to that, which is about transparency being the key to that. And at the moment, it's not transparent how the various bodies relate to each other. We have both the glory and the pain of the Church of England dispersed authority. It provides a check and a balance, but it also means that there is opacity. The vision question, I think, really relates to what we in the group referred to as the wiring. How do the different groups we have relate to each other? How do we ensure in any future arrangement that the wiring is such that it's effective in communication and accountability, but doesn't lead to a renewed opacity? The third question, Father Thomas, about subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, which is a word that doesn't come up much in the report, but came up much in our deliberations, because we only want the sens, which I said last night, if you end up becoming a member of that, it means you've been incensed. But you can take that as you like, is to enable at national level, only those things to happen at national level that have to happen at national level, so important decisions taken as close to the ground as possible. But we can't have it both ways. We can't demand subsidiarity and all that goes with that, and then complain endlessly that we haven't put in the right structures in order to enable the national body to do what they do effectively, efficiently, and efficaciously.
Thank you. And I apologise for my pronunciation, Karen Jabkowski. She's done it. Thank you, Karen. And then we will have the lady there, and you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Bishop of Leeds. Karen Chapiewski, Gloucester 313. Thank you to the Bishop of Leeds and to the working group for the way in which this issue has been highlighted, analysed, and has started to be addressed. At the risk of repeating points already made and trying hard not to, it seems vital that we follow not only Christian principles and ideals in all we do, but also that we comply with the Nolan principles of good governance. As a church, we're entrusted with a wealth of resources to enable our mission. As we heard this morning from John Spence, among those resources are high-caliber staff of the type who are being headhunted, as well as beautiful buildings and wealth we seek to preserve for future generations. However, our current governance structures facilitate much of the work being carried out in silos. We need to be able to join up that allows not only...
Could you ask the question, please? Thank you.
I would like to say, how are we going to guarantee that we can achieve that join-up in accordance with Nolan principles and ensure that we make best use of our resources in constructing working groups that are properly scrutinised?
Lisa Batty, Manchester 169. Thank you for inviting my questions. I have two brief ones. One, given that most, if not all, of those over 100 second-tier bodies referred to in paragraph 148 on page 34 will regard what they do as essential, how does the review group propose to identify bodies which are not essential and dissolve them? That was my first question. The second one is the recommendation number 3 about electing 12 members from the College of Bishops to form a board of bishops. How would those 12 members, assuming they are not all members of this body, stay in tune with God's work through this body?
Ireland, 69 Blackburn. When I served as an elected member of the Archbishop's Council, there was always a creative tension between the Archbishop's Council and the House of Bishops Standing Committee, particularly when it came to matters of vision and strategy. Coming back to Synod after a few years' absence, and when I read this document, I thought, well, clearly the House of Bishops Standing Committee has won that particular tussle. Although it will be the College of Bishops rather than the House of Bishops Standing Committee. But that does raise a question which I'd like to draw you out on as to where the clergy and lay voices may lose out in their representation. Particularly, I think the issue resolves, as I heard you, Bishop Nick, around the tension between efficiency and ownership. You raised the issue that if the popular elections don't produce people with the necessary skills for governance, there's an argument for more power to nominations committee. But by increasing their role and reducing the role of elections, how will you avoid the unintended consequence of decisions being made by smaller groups of appointed people not being owned by the wider church, and particularly by the lay voices, which are so important as we carry forward setting God's people free?
Bishop Nick.
Karen Chapievsky, the Nolan principles are crucial. We heard them referred to yesterday as well. The 7 principles of good governance, which you find in the report, you will find rooted in the Nolan principles. And any new arrangement that emerges from this must pay attention to the Nolan principles. I was asked, I think, by Karen about guaranteeing the join-up in accordance with them. I ought to be quite clear, you can't guarantee anything. Our report is about saying, here is the direction of travel. And then if the Synod eventually accepts or takes note of the report, whatever the process is early in the new year, then that's when the detail starts to get picked over and some of these detailed questions get attended to. And that's when we really need to have the debates about how do you ensure, and what looks good to one person might look hold beneath the water to someone else. That's what debate is for. This is iterative as we go, including today. But the whole point about setting up working groups means that they would have, task and finish groups, if you like, rather than 122 committees, is that they would have a clear remit. People going on to them would have a clear role description, because at the moment many don't. And once the work was done, they would cease. It was suggested in a meeting last night that maybe this synod, an important role of the synod, would be to scrutinise the work that SENS does and some of these groups. So there are practical ways of ensuring that scrutiny takes place. But again, I would caution, sometimes things look very good on paper. You go in with the best intentions, and then you discover as you go that they don't work. That's why we're here today. Lisa Batty, 122 groups that deem themselves to be essential. I'm not sure they all would, actually. But Lisa, I can't see where you are. Right. It's not for the governance review group to dissolve any of them. It's for a new arrangement, a new body, to decide what it needed. And what we've put in the report is the basic committees that any charitable trust, any charitable body needs now in order to be able to function. After that, keep it lean and tight. So again, we can't complain that we're top-heavy, but then not have a mechanism, and the mechanism for doing it will be the responsibility of the new body, but then not have a mechanism whereby we actually get a bit ruthless. But the point is made, anyone and everybody believes their work to be essential. We're going to have to find a way of deciding whether they are or not. The 12 members of the Board of Bishops, I just want to say on that the underlying concern here is that the House of Bishops has very easily accrued to itself over time a finger in lots of pies in which it needn't have a finger. And therefore, pulling it back to being what it actually is in law, which is a synodical house, seems to be a fairly radical thing. I mean, you could call it an example of a group saying, let's take... Maybe we're not as essential as we thought we were in every aspect of this work. Let's try and be radical with this. But the General Synod, I think, would continue to have an important role here, because the role of the Board of Bishops is to simply make relationships and communication between the bishops and the other bodies as effective as possible. That will depend on who goes onto that board and how that mechanism is applied. But I ought to say that what we are proposing with the Nominations Commission is that bishops wouldn't be exempt from that. So if a bishop was going to go on to a body that required a particular expertise, it would be for that body to recognise that the relevant bishops do have that expertise. And if they don't, that ought to be highlighted. So we're trying to be consistent. Again, might not be the right mechanism. There may be a better way of doing this, but what we're trying to get on the table is let's find a way of doing this. But we've got to solve that problem. Mark Ireland, the House of Bishops Standing Committee has won. I'm not so sure, actually, because what we're trying to do here is to reduce the top, if you like, the centre, make it more streamlined, and therefore to allow greater representation throughout the system that is there. This is why the synodical question is important, and how we tackle what everyone thinks is dysfunctional about synod, but is very difficult to grapple with. I don't think clergy and lay voices would be lost in representation, because we're not saying we reduce elections. There would still be elections, not necessarily to every single body, but because some of those will be task-finished groups that are functional and able to get particular things done. But the elections and the way you get onto those bodies will still come through the system. I mean, you could have people in your parishes saying, well, why do we trust you? You were elected by deanery synods to the general synod, but you're not representing my particular parish. At some point, you have to say we trust that those we elect and we appoint to act in good faith. And we will learn as we go.
Thank you. Deborah McIsaac. The gentleman there, thank you. And in the very attractive waistcoat, thank you. Oh, Deborah's coming behind you. So.
Thank you. Debbie McIsaac, Salisbury 402. I'd first like to refer to the reference to General Synod as the elephant in the room, and ask whether, given the longevity of an elephant's memory, that might have been a unhappily chosen expression in this context. The second thing I'd like to refer to is paragraph 137, which describes this new body as being a national vision and strategy setting body and a resource services organization. I'd like to know where the appropriate and robust institutional and representative checks and balances are to be found in these proposals. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Leslie Seuss at Edmondsbury in Ipswich 209. Bishops in the Book of Common Prayer Liturgy for Consecration are called pastors of the church, that they may diligently preach thy word and duly administer the godly discipline thereof. To what extent do the proposed changes to governance have in mind to enable bishops to give themselves more fully to that work rather than just admin and bureaucracy? Thank you.
Bruce Bryant Scott, Diocese in Europe, 113. I want to thank the Governance Review Group for the remarkable piece of work that they have done, and I'm sure that we will benefit from the majority, if not all, of their recommendations. I speak as someone who is an outsider, although now I suppose an insider, being part of General Synod, a Canadian, and someone in the non-established diocese in Europe. First of all, I have two questions. First, was any consideration made to look at other parts of the Anglican Communion or other non-Anglican churches to see what methods were working very well so that we can carry out the mission of God far more effectively than we have? So there was a reference on page 14 to looking at the NHS, but for our mission in particular, have we looked at effective places that are growing, such as the Church of Nigeria or other places? Second question, and this is a bit of a, maybe a naive question, but was there any consideration that we might let go of the Constantinian chains of establishment so that we might become a more humble, simple organization that can let go, stop grasping on to prestige and power, and empty ourselves into the incarnate form of Christ? Thank you.
Bishop Nick.
I really don't want to speak about elephants. Checks and balances, Deborah, you're absolutely right. I mean, essential to the work going forward will be the testing, the stress testing of any proposals that get worked up as to where the checks and balances are. I mean, that goes to the heart of the good governance principles and the Nolan principles. But we have to stress test them. And it's in the next stage of that work where, if it gets the go-ahead, then specific proposals will come that need to be then tested out. And that question about checks and balances will need to be there. You need, for example, on any board, to have the, I'm not sure what the right phrase is, but an outside eye that isn't bought into the internal culture, that isn't enculturated, in order to ask the questions that the people on a board have got used not to asking. You know what I mean? That's why election to the Sens must deliver people who maybe aren't completely experienced in the specifics of elements of that work, but they are sufficiently engaged to be able to ask the really hard questions and to challenge the culture. Leslie, how do we envisage enabling bishops to be pastors and to do all of that? If this works well, it'll mean that bishops have more time if they choose. I mean, we can all fill our time as we wish, but we'll have more space and more headspace to get on in their dioceses, which I thought was our job. But let's, again, not be naive about this. These come down to choices. David, thank you. You refer to the Anglican Communion, non-Anglican churches. Did we look at any of that? Yes, we did. But the thing you keep coming back to is the complexity of the Church of England because of establishment, because of the historic endowment. Now, again, if you want to get rid of all of that, I hope you weren't speaking this morning demanding of the church commissioners money for this, that, and the other, because it all goes together. We have our engagement with Parliament. I won't say too much more about that, but if we were simply setting up the governance for a church, which other churches are looking at, the Methodists are looking at this at the moment as well, and there is nothing like the Church of England, genuinely. So if you're going to really engage with governance reform, you have to take that uniqueness, which isn't to defend it, it just is unique. And we have to deal with that. On the establishment, no, we didn't look should the church disestablish, our agenda was big enough. And you will know, some of you at least, that when we set out on our work, we also wanted to look at culture, not just structures and systems, but culture and leadership. And we just didn't have time to do it. And I'm just being completely open with you about that. We think they are integral to the work and lie behind some of the questions we've had. But we did not have the capacity or the time to address those questions. So they've got to be addressed as we go forward, and there has to be coherence. But I would counter that I don't think establishment is simply about prestige and power. It's about something I referred to this morning. It brings to us an obligation, a missional obligation. And I don't know any bishop, for example, in the House of Lords, who sees it as a bit of a jolly or the acceptance of prestige and power, but we take it on as a massive obligation and often a huge burden, which sometimes some of us feel we could do without. But we do it because that is what we are called to do that no one else is.
I'm going to take final two questions, the prolocutor and the gentleman right at the back.
Thank you, Chair. Simon Butler, Southwark 221, returning from yesterday's rather more dramatic intervention to my usual areas of good decision-making and governance. The long grass thing about Synod, I wonder if I could make a proposal that you might comment on. We're about to elect the standing committees of the three houses. And it seems to me that if Synod is going to be reformed, it is those bodies, this Synod, that needs to own that responsibility.
Could you get a bit closer to the microphone, please?
Could you hear all of that?
The cunt at that end.
So I was saying we're about to elect the standing committees. And it seems to me that the Synod is the body that needs to make decisions about the future of Synod. And so I wonder, perhaps in about a year's time, whether it might be sensible, once we've all got our feet under the desk and new members of Synod are here, for the three standing committees to meet in a very serious way to consider this matter, so that it doesn't get kicked into the long grass and that we pick it up and run with it alongside all the good work that the Governance Review Group will set in train. Thank you.
Temi Tope Taro, 360 London Diocese. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Bishop, for that very comprehensive presentation. Much of what was spoken struck a deep chord within me, and I would like to make a question or ask a question on the back of some of the recommendations. So this question is grounded in my capacity as an ordinand and discipleship pastor of a church in an urban, creative, and quite rapidly growing part of East London, where I get the privilege of leading between 200 to 300 young people in weekly Bible studies. Now, many of these young people who are young millennials and either unchurched or de-churched have been struck on a weekly basis by the perspicuity of Scripture, often commenting on how rich, deep, and here's the key part, clear Scripture is to understand. However, when it comes to church matters or how the C of V is governed, these same young people become extremely confused. Now, in light of this, my question is, should the proposals to streamline language, structures, and bodies go ahead, what consideration has been or will be made to ensure that these changes are clear to and even informed by everyday young churchgoers who may love the Bible, but today are utterly bewildered by the church that was started in the Bible? Thank you.
Good place to finish, Bishop Nick. Thank you.
Simon Butler, isn't self-sacrifice at the heart of the church's gospel? And shouldn't that also be characterized, or shouldn't that characterize our institutions, rather than defending interests, constantly looking at the interests, the wider interests of the others? So your proposal that the three standing committees meet in maybe a year's time is a very good example of the Synod taking responsibility for the Synod, not waiting to be reshaped by someone else. But it demands maturity, and being grasped by a spirit of self-sacrifice in the greater interests of the whole. And as the next stage of the work gets moving, after if that happens after the debate in February, then I would suggest that if the 3 standing committees do meet together, they liaise then with that group so that there is some coherence and clarity of communication, so we don't just go off on different tracks and then you end up putting all your energy and time into extinguishing fires that needn't have been lit in the first place, which of course couldn't happen in ordinary church life. Temi, I mean, it's great to hear stories of local growth, and there are many of them. You know, let's not be shy about that. There are many struggles as well, but there are many examples of growth. And how we communicate what happens at this level of the church is sometimes a challenge. Communication is never simple. It's not just young people who are confused. But you can't simply draw a straight line from the Bible to how a church like this, given the complexity of our history and our development, ought to be governed. You know, you might find the Nolan Principles and the 7 Principles of Good Governance in the Bible. I mean, you can find anything if you look closely enough and, you know, talk to the media. But there aren't those straight lines. And the next stage of this project needs to be clear debate, including, and I hope, Tammy, that you will keep pressing this, how do we translate this work into ways that can be understood? Now, look, I used to be a professional linguist. This was my job, dealing with language. And it's pretty evident that anything a church puts out can't be simply put out in one form. So something we might put in a paper to the General Synod is not necessarily going to be immediately comprehensible to some of the people I'll meet in a parish on Sunday morning, and nor can it be. I remember Rowan Williams saying, when we drive for everything to be simple, I apologise to the Archbishop of York for this, not everything is simple. Some things are by their nature complex. But we shouldn't be shy about admitting that complexity, but then finding ways of translating or, and I would suggest perhaps more relevantly, interpreting. There are different exercises, interpreting and translating. But interpreting in different languages at different levels seems to me to be essential. The genius is going to be at what point and at what stage do you translate and interpret what? Do you wait until we've established something that looks like it's going to have some coherence? Or do you bang something out that is going to be out of date before it's gone, and then everyone's confused because, you know, another iteration is going to come round and they go, what's going on? That's about tactics, it's about communication. And I think it's probably enough before I do a lecture on language.
Thank you, Bishop Nick. Thank you to everyone who's participated. As you know, we'll hear a lot more about all of this. So that brings this item to a close, and we move next to item 13, farewells.
Good afternoon again, Synod. Our first item is to invite the Bishop of Manchester to deliver a farewell to Dr. Eve Poole, 3rd Church Estates Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. David Walker, 27, Bishop of Manchester. Eve sadly isn't able to be with us this afternoon. She has promised that she is going to be following this on the live feed. So hi, Eve, up in Scotland, wherever you are. It was last month that Dr. Eve Poole stepped down as our 3rd Church Estates Commissioner, but she has been a remarkable commissioner. Such a unique blend of talents, experiences, motivations and styles. And we've been very fortunate to have had them at our disposal in the last 3 and a bit years since her appointment by my colleague on my right here. Eve's not so much a person of contradictions, though, but rather a uniquely drawn person with different but complementary facets. Just a brief snapshot of her career will show us that. She actually began working life in the early 1990s as part of the One Millbank machine, supporting the Commissioner's pastoral and closed churches work. Some of us could go on a longer discussion about the loss of One Millbank and the little restaurant down in the basement, but perhaps not more recent members. But she's great at, as well as the detail, creative leadership. She can see both the big picture and understand where that minute detail needs to be got right for the big picture to actually emerge. Think of some kind of pointillist artist, if you may. She went on to become the go-getting, high-achieving Deloitte management consultant, Ashridge Business School associate, not just with the MBA that we kind of might have expected, but a PhD in theology and capitalism. For those of you who think that's a contradiction in terms, see me or Alan Smith later. But she's also a very proud Scot, but one who is adept at working the English establishment. But most strikingly of all, this outstanding, compelling teacher, writer, speaker, whose favourite phrase is, let's have a natter, also really likes a jolly good listen. We've actually heard about listening quite a few times in this group of sessions, haven't we, Synod? And Eve is an exemplar that's shown itself many times, but none more strikingly than that long period of discussion that turned a report on cathedrals into the new cathedrals measure. Synod eventually agreed it almost unanimously. This measure has made a huge contribution to the life of the church and the nation. We need to remember how fraught the conversations were at the beginning. I remember being in this chamber when the then Bishop of Stepney first produced the report. It was not an easy debate. It's been an extraordinary journey, and key to it has been what might one call the energetic listening of Eve. She heard dissenters. She heard hopes and fears of every cathedral. She heard eminent theologians who she personally gathered together. She heard parliamentarians, members of Synod, and many others. And that got us over the line. And from her first day in office, she pushed for greater recognition of the unique place of cathedrals, for this to be recognised in national funding decisions. That resulted in an initial £10 million allocation to the Cathedral Sustainability Funding for this triennium. And then when COVID struck us, she negotiated a further £10 million to replenish the fund. That helped cathedrals not only to survive, but to develop, enabled the commissioners to respond very quickly to provide emergency funds to those most at risk. And her insistence on more imaginative use of national funding enabled match funding arrangements to provide a lifeline to those vital cathedral close heritage crafts, things like music and the building skills for our amazing buildings. Under her leadership, the Bishoprics and Cathedrals Committee has also pushed ahead with a Sea House sustainability project. They're coming to visit my house next week, and increased bishops' use of electric and hybrid cars. And of course, she's expertly chaired our Mission, Pastoral and Church Property Committee in its complex quasi-judicial role and functions. When she started, this was two separate committees, but she oversaw their merger and simplification. There's another favourite Synod word. Throughout this transition, it's handled a high volume of work ranging from exceptionally difficult and contested pastoral reorganisation cases to securing imaginative use for closed churches and even the careful removal of some very special murals. And all that has relied on that wide gift set, her thoughtfulness, her compassion, her ability to de-escalate contentious matters. Eve's also been a great driver of our diversity agenda, chairing the panels that produced exciting new appointments and initiating a successful outreach and pipelining event, the first of what we hope will be a series, and advocating for underrepresented groups in the workplace. She is, of course, something of a governance guru and has written extensively on that subject. And that's helped focus our thinking on how we maintain and improve good governance. It has been helped by her endless supply of Tunnock's chocolate biscuits that she famously shared with all her visitors. I tried to find some in her office this morning, but she's taken them all back up to Scotland with her. I do hope and pray that Tunnock's can survive and flourish without her regular ferrying of copious supplies of their products across the Scottish border. All of these achievements owe much to her persistence, her articulacy, and her great care. Her care for people, her care for ideas, her care for God's church and its mission. So Synod, please pray for us as we seek out Eve's successor, but also let's hold in our prayers Eve, her husband Nathan, their twin daughters, now that she's stepped down from her roles both here as First Church Estates Commissioner and as the first ever female chair of governors of Gordonstoun School. We thank God that Eve will spend less time in transit between Edinburgh and London, and that her family can enjoy more of her time, even if that overnight sleeper service has lost one of its most courteous, reliable, and frequent customers. But of course, we do already. Eve, we miss you very much.
I'd like to invite the Archbishop of Canterbury to deliver the farewell for Caroline Boddington, the Archbishop's advisor on appointments.
Justin Welby, Canterbury 001. Caroline was appointed to the role of Archbishop's Appointments Secretary in 2004. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, and as you no doubt all remember, the top hot 100 song of the year was Year by Usher, featuring Lil Jon and Ludacris. I won't sing it. In many ways, Caroline has been a devoted servant of the church, not just over those 17 years, but for years and years and years before that, in her faithful service in the choir in a church in London, and her own deep Christian faith. When she was appointed, there was some concern that she was bringing the commercial world to the church, having worked previously with British Gas. Those of us who worked in the oil industry a bit earlier and had to deal with British Gas would scarcely have had that fear. But we would have certainly feared their tyranny. However, those of us who have had the privilege of working closely with Caroline know that her faith is central to her life, and she is a theologian in that she says her prayers and is committed to the well-being of the church. I first met her quite shortly after her appointment, at which point, with unusual prescience, she said she couldn't ever see me being any good as a bishop, but I might be of some value as a dean. She was, of course, entirely right. It is hard to exaggerate the gratitude that we owe to Caroline. She has overseen a word which I will come back to, is next in my notes, but I'll come back to it. It begins with P and ends in S, and has 2 other S's and a C in it, and I'll leave you to think about that, for appointing all the diocesan bishops and archbishops across the Church of England. All the diocesan bishops and archbishops across the Church of England. It is not for nothing that some years ago, a very well-known weekly newspaper, I think, declared her to be the most powerful person in the Church of England. And she's also appointed almost all the deans and many other senior appointments, both clerical and lay. When I say she's appointed, I mean she's appointed. Now, the word I missed out was the word process. Queen Mary, the first Queen Mary, said that when she died, Calais would be found inscribed on her heart. With Caroline, it would be the word process. And this brings me to a confession. I'm into confessions this week. It brings me to a confession. She's had to deal in her second Archbishop of Canterbury, but her 4th Archbishop, I think, with someone for whom the word process was perhaps not his favourite word in the dictionary. Hers unquestionably is the word process. And as a result, as Archbishop Stephen would recognise, and Lord Sentamu would also recognise, there have been many occasions when halfway through a CNC or a CNC process, she has, you see how you've got me doing it now, so you have succeeded, Caroline, that halfway through a CNC, she said, "But Archbishop, the process is," and I've said, "I'm not going to follow the process," and have gone deliberately and consciously forward, ignoring the process. At which point she said, "But Archbishop, the process," and we've ended up following the process. She is indeed the most powerful person in the Church of England. Simply noting, though, her capacity for overseeing the complexity of our appointments, which I am often asked about. I was in Africa on one occasion just before, after I'd been nominated to this role, but before it actually took place. I won't say where I was, but in a particular country in Africa, and I was invited, because I'd been nominated to this role, to some gathering of the great and the good, and there was a very senior member of the establishment there, very close to the head of that country, and he'd obviously come along under sufferance, was bored stiff by talking to me. You may know the feeling. And he said, how do you become Archbishop of Canterbury? So I explained, and he grew more and more glazed, but I knew the process, Caroline. I explained it well. He looked more and more bored, even more bored than I was. Then I said, it ends up with you being elected by the College of Canons of the Cathedral. And he brightened up. He said, "Oh, we've just had an election here, and I ran the election campaign. When's your election?" I said, "Next Thursday." It was about 6 days later. And he said, "Shouldn't you be campaigning?" I said, "No, there's only one candidate. And it's something approaching treason to vote against them if you're a canon." And he sat back in his chair and said, now, without a touch of humour, "Now, that is the kind of election I like." It was, moreover, the kind of election he organised. He and Caroline would have got on well. She oversaw a rigorous process which led to an election with one candidate, and it was against the law to vote against them. Bear that in mind next time you're talking to her. She has worked well with colleagues right across the church. She is extraordinarily insightful. She spots quickly people's strengths and weaknesses, and powerfully. And she has been instrumental in putting forward ideas about the projects others were leading on, and in being invaluable, and here I'm not for once being ironic, in areas way beyond her own area of responsibility. She understands the hows of government, not just the what of governance. So how you make it work. And that is an invaluable skill. She's worked closely with the Prime Minister's office, with 5 Prime Ministers, under 5 Prime Ministers, and, as I've said, a number of archbishops. It was, of course, during her time that one of our great successes in training was put together. It was a bid for the resources to set up the SLDP, Senior Leadership Development Programme, and to begin work with clergy to help them in their ministry and their spiritual life. The work done was not universally acclaimed by all, as any who remember the Green Report will recall. It has, however, under her leadership, developed superbly. And it was very striking to see the number of people coming through that process in cohort after cohort, deeply formed and enthusiastic about their training program. It is a deliberately disruptive program, enabling people to be forced to think again. To quote 2 people who'd gone through it, they said parts of it were messing with our heads, a very helpful thing to do, and someone else said one part of it took us to the edge of words. Caroline, your team was instrumental in the profound development, and you led that, of those people. It's a huge gift. Caroline has advised on a wider range of appointments, not only clerical ones. She's been instrumental in constantly reviewing the work of the Crown Nominations Commission, and most recently she was a key part of the O'Donovan report on responsible representation. All the reforms she has overseen have been done with thoroughness and high quality, and also been driven by her own sense of building on what God wants and striving to discern the right thing to do. There have been other appointments that she's made. Of course, the most significant of them was when she came across a certain then suffragan bishop who is now her husband. In terms of process, that is a more questionable process, but it seems to have been one of the most delightful and excellent ones which we rejoice in. Alistair Redfern and Caroline were and are a formidable couple, and worked together on issues relating to vocation and what it means to be a bishop and how it can be lived out. So, Caroline, we now say thank you, and no words are adequate to express our thanks for your extraordinary service before your appointment and since your appointment, and I have no doubt in the future in your continuing vocation, for all the ways in which you've helped shape the future of the Church. I hope and pray genuinely and deeply, and with much gratitude for your occasional lectures on process, privately and publicly, for our occasionally reasonably robust discussions, which I always lost. I give thanks to you for that and for the training you've given me, without me always being aware of it, and certainly not always sufficiently grateful for it. We know your love of music and choral work, and we know that you've taught the Church to sing better in tune with the Spirit of God in its searching for appointments to those who have an impact on so many. Thank you, and may God bless you in all you continue to do in his name. Please do stand, Caroline.
I now invite the Archbishop of Canterbury to deliver the farewell to the Bishop of Lincoln, Christopher Lowson.
Christopher Lowson has been ordained for 44 years. He served first in parishes in the Southwark Diocese before moving to Portsmouth Diocese, where, as well as serving in parishes, he then became Archdeacon of Portsdown in 1991. He moved from Portsmouth to become Director of Ministry and Church House in 2006 and was consecrated Bishop of Lincoln in 2011. Inevitably, the extraordinary events that Christopher has endured over recent years have made an impact upon him and upon the diocese and indeed upon the whole church. When I met with Christopher earlier this year, he made it very clear that he was sorry for the events and did apologize for the wrong he'd done. I also made it very clear that I was sorry for the way the matter had been handled by me and the length of time it had taken to come to a conclusion, and, including that, the length of time that he had suffered suspension. I want to say that sorry again now, in public, with both Christopher and Susan here. I apologize again for that terrible period of your lives together, for which I feel a deep personal responsibility. Of course, because survivors will hear this, in no way do I retract anything on the absolutely central place of safeguarding for the Church of England, something which Christopher would agree with me on, past, present, and future. Survivors matter fundamentally. Survivors in Lincoln matter fundamentally. They suffered and must be central. But our failures historically in safeguarding and profound injustice in those failures do not excuse delay in cases like Chris. Clearly, there is much work still to do in reforming the clergy discipline measure and reviewing our processes. And I hope that it is a very tiny bit of comfort for Christopher and Susan in knowing that their grim experience will help us think more deeply about that, and I trust more kindly. The words from those in the diocese which sum up the ministry exercised by Chris are warmth, generosity, and creativity. He is always willing to think and explore outside the box and to take risks, transforming the governance of the diocese where he inherited a very, very difficult situation and leaving on a sound organizational setting. He was well aware of the complexities of the communities that make up that very remarkable historic diocese. Its rural nature, its urban, coastal estates, market towns. It is impossible to stereotype it in any way at all. He had a real and genuine passion and desire for the gospel and to see lives and communities transformed by the person of Jesus. One example of that was the setting up of the Bishop of Lincoln's Social Justice Fund, which has seen £1 million released to social justice projects across the whole of Greater Lincolnshire. One colleague told me of listening to you, Chris, as you talked about the cross to a group of clergy at a breakfast meeting called To Think About Giving, a meeting which was repeated about a dozen times, and each time you had tears in your eyes as you tried to express what that meant for Christ and what it meant to you. The Lincoln Diocese has many issues to grapple with, and Christopher has been clear in leading the diocese about his own view of ministerial priesthood and the nature of the church. During his time as director of ministry, the whole church benefited from the wisdom and experience Christopher brought to that vital role. He asked the important questions and worked to support the bishops and the church right across the country. It was typical of him that during his time in Church House, he was also a priest vicar of Westminster Abbey, ensuring his own ministerial life was maintained and his involvement with the wider church. Christopher and Susan will retire to London at the end of this year, and Christopher will continue to be connected to the local church. I'm sure he will also keep connections with the wider church as well, and I hope and pray that we will be able to use his experience and wisdom in the future. During his time as Bishop of Lincoln, the diocese has been working towards what it means to be sustainable, and the vision for the diocese is a time to change together. Christopher has been leading on this vision, and of course also challenging all in the diocese to consider their own sense of discipleship with 3 words which they use: faithful, confident, and joyful. Christopher has a passion not only for teaching, but also for studying, having gained a master's from Haythrop College in 1996 and the LLM in Cardiff in 2003. He has served on the Clergy Discipline Commission and the Legal Advisory Commission. Christopher and Susan, this Synod wants to say thank you to you and to wish you well in your retirement. It has been more than a difficult few years, and we cannot ignore the reality of what you have endured and the impact it will have had on you and the church. But at this stage, I want to thank you, to acknowledge your faithful service, to acknowledge your heart turned towards Christ, to acknowledge your discipleship, and to pray that in your continuing pilgrimage and ministry, that God will bless you in all that you do. Thank you.
I now invite the Archbishop of York to deliver the farewell for the Bishop of Newcastle, Christine Hardman.
And Christine, Roger, how nice also to see you both in the gallery. As I begin this farewell, I'm very conscious, Synod, that we might be witnessing a moment of history in the life of the General Synod. Why? Because this is actually Christine's second Synod farewell. The other was given by my predecessor in July 2014. On that occasion, this body was thanking Christine for her 14 years on Synod and her role as prolocutor of the province of Canterbury and wishing her a long and happy retirement. Well, it hasn't turned out like that. Christine, you don't make many mistakes, but maybe at this point, as the old joke has it, how do you make God laugh? Answer, tell him your plans. Christine, maybe you thought you knew what the future held. But of course, as we know, to our great delight, God had other plans, and 18 short months later, Christine was consecrated Bishop of Newcastle, becoming the first female diocesan bishop in the Northern Province. Of course, being first is something we've come to expect from you, Christine, because you were among the first wave of women to be ordained to the priesthood back in 1987. You were the first woman to serve as prodicator of the province of Canterbury, the first female bishop to be a season ticket holder for Newcastle United. By the way, they're still going to need your prayers. And 6 years might not seem very long, but brothers and sisters, if you want an example of what a bishop can achieve in a relatively short space of time, look no further than the Newcastle diocese. Christine, your ministry has been a joy and absolutely transformative. You have had such an influence on our church and on our lives. You've enabled your diocese to become much more outward-facing, rooted in the reality of the circumstances it finds itself, whether that's the vibrant city of Newcastle or the rural parishes weaving their way across Hadrian's Wall, or the liminal, replenishing tranquility of Holy Island with all its heritage, the inspiration and example of Aidan, of place and pilgrimage. But regardless of the location, the Newcastle diocese, as I've come to know in my so far fairly short time in the Northern Province, is so alive with a desire to reach and serve people where they are, at whatever stage in life, and always with the love of Christ, the joy of the gospel, a message of hospitality and hope in a part of our country which is so often overlooked, a place where there is great deprivation and suffering, and where there needs to be investment and opportunity. And as I shall come on to in a moment, what a champion for the Northeast you have become. But Christine, you've also made a massive contribution to our national church life. You've served on too many to mention groups of our Church of England, including the Steering Committee for Women Bishops Legislation, Spending Plans Task Group, the Archbishop's Council, the House of Bishops Steering Committee, to name just a few. All of them have benefited from your commitment and wisdom. In the past, you often explained legislation to the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament. Now, in the House of Lords, you scrutinise that legislation, always bringing to your work tenacity, faithfulness, and a great desire to get things done. And let's not also overlook the hugely important work in recent years of the Pastoral Advisory Group, which Christine oversaw, perhaps born of the many struggles that her generation faced as the legislation for the ordination of women as priests and then bishops made its way through the church. Christine, you have helped us see how we can honour, love, and respect one another with our differences. And in my experience of serving with you and knowing you as a friend, it's your tenacious and robust kindness which is one of the greatest gifts that you have brought to the church you love. Christine, you are nothing if not energetic. I am reliably informed that most of your mornings begin with a run. I've also been told that on your run, you listen to Ed Sheeran. I won't hold that against you, well, not today. But then, of course, it is morning prayer. And here, as one of the pioneer generation of female priests and bishops, and Synod, it's so important for us to understand that. Christine is one of the great pioneers of our church in the last 30 or 40 years. I want to pay tribute to your spiritual vision, your love of Christ, the way your life and ministry is sustained and replenished through your relationship with Christ in word and sacrament. Your love for the outdoors is well known, although not always appreciated by members of your bishop's staff. I'm told residentials include an obligatory walk, or as it is known by them, the bishop's route march. Christine, the Diocese of Newcastle will miss you. The staff in your office will miss you. I know they have enjoyed teaching you the correct Geordie pronunciation of the names of parishes in the diocese. And you've learned those lessons well. You have become such a valued part of the North East that Synod, you may not know, the city of Newcastle recently honoured Christine by making her the first ever faith leader to be granted the freedom of the city. What a tribute. Christine, my dear friend, this is the impact you have had. Truly showing how the church can be the church for the entire nation, not just itself. In Newcastle and in Northumbria, you've established so many good relations across government, business and third sector, and they will miss you. Colleagues across the Northern Province, the entire College of Bishops, we will miss you. Your candour, intellect, spiritual and pastoral gifts have so blessed our Church of England. Somebody has peeked into your blue file. On a certain BAP report many years ago, it said that Christine would be a great asset to any parish staff. 40 years later, we say a very big amen to that. You've not just been an asset, but an absolutely remarkable presence in the life of the church and to God's mission. So, Christine, my dear sister, for the second time, we wish you and your beloved husband, Roger, who has always been such a wise and trusted companion and support to you in your ministry, a really enjoyable retirement. So, no, there's one more. Sit down. Hey, Mr. Bell. Perhaps I should start. Yeah. I hadn't actually finished, but I had a marvellous last line, which was simply to say, Christine, don't forget, there will be more.
A meeting of the House of Laity will take place in this chamber, commencing 15 minutes after prorogation. In order for the chamber to be set up for that meeting, can you, after the prorogation and after, leave the room as quickly as possible?
Sorry. Members of Synod, for the two-thirds of you who are new, prorogation is the cue for being led by the former Bishop of Newcastle on a lengthy walk around the centre of London. So if you would quickly go down and meet out the front in your running shoes. It's just about as likely as what I'm about to say. Prorogation will be followed by a prayer and a blessing. In the name of God, Amen. We, Justin Portal, by divine providence, Archbishop of Canterbury, do now prorogue this synod to and until the 7th day of February next, subject to the powers exercisable by the presidents under the Constitution and the standing orders of the Synod. Please stand. Yesterday, Liz Paver was taken ill at the start of this synod and is in St. Thomas's Hospital. I'm going to pray for her before the closing blessing. Lord of all healing and comfort, we pray for your presence with Liz at this time, for your grace to her, for your healing in her, and for your comfort. We lift her to you in our love for her, knowing your infinitely greater love. In Jesus' name, amen. So may the Spirit of peace fill your hearts with the knowledge and love of God. Light up your imagination with the hope of God. Strengthen you with the force of God. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be amongst you and remain with you always. Amen. Go in peace, leaving the chamber quickly, to love and serve the Lord.